The rain came down in sheets that October evening, turning the dirt roads of Millbrook County into rivers of mud. It was 1989, and the small farming community in rural Nebraska had never seen anything like what was about to unfold. The kind of thing that changes a place forever, that makes mothers hold their children closer and fathers check the locks twice before bed. 15-year-old Rebecca Hayes was supposed to be home by 6 o'clock. She had volleyball practice at Millbrook High School, same as every Tuesday and Thursday. Her mother, Dorothy Hayes, had pot roast in the oven and mashed potatoes on the stove. Rebecca's younger brother, Tommy, was setting the table. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. Except Rebecca never came home. At 6:15, Dorothy called the school. No answer. The building would be locked by now, the janitor making his rounds, the gymnasium dark and empty. At 6:30, she called Rebecca's best friend, Julie Winters. Julie said practice had ended at 5, same as always. She had seen Rebecca walking toward the parking lot, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder, her blonde ponytail swinging as she moved. Nothing seemed wrong. Nothing seemed different. By 7 o'clock, Dorothy Hayes was calling the police. Sheriff Tom Brennan had been with the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department for 23 years. He had handled bar fights, domestic disputes, the occasional theft. But missing children, that was something else entirely. When Dorothy's call came through, he felt his stomach drop. He told her to stay calm, to call anyone who might have seen Rebecca. He would start a search immediately. The problem was this: Millbrook was not a big town. 3,000 people, give or take. One main street with a diner, a hardware store, a pharmacy. The high school sat on the eastern edge of town, surrounded by cornfields that stretched for miles in every direction. If Rebecca had gotten lost, if she had wandered off the road, she could be anywhere. And with the rain coming down the way it was, any tracks or evidence would be washed away within hours. Sheriff Brennan organized a search party. Volunteers showed up with flashlights and raincoats, their faces grim, and they spread out across the fields, calling Rebecca's name into the darkness. The wind howled in response, and the rain kept falling. By midnight they had found nothing. By 3 in the morning, Dorothy Hayes was hysterical, and her husband, Frank, held her as she sobbed into his chest. Tommy sat on the stairs, his face pale, his hands trembling. This was not how things were supposed to go. This was not how life worked in Millbrook. People did not just vanish, but Rebecca had. The next morning, the search resumed. State police arrived with tracking dogs. The dogs picked up a scent near the school parking lot, followed it down the main road for about half a mile, then lost it completely. It's gone, as if Rebecca had evaporated into thin air. Sheriff Brennan interviewed everyone. Teachers, students, parents. Julie Winters sat in his office, tears streaming down her face, and told him everything she could remember. Rebecca had seemed fine. She had joked about a test in history class, complained about her sore legs from practice. She had said goodbye at 5:05, waved and started walking home. That was the last time anyone had seen her, or so they thought. On the third day, a farmer named Ed Kowalski called the sheriff's office. He had been checking his fences out near the old Riverside Road when he found something, a volleyball, muddy and deflated, lying in the ditch. It matched the description of the one Rebecca had been carrying. The search shifted. Riverside Road was 2 miles from the school, far off Rebecca's usual route home. Why would she have gone that way? The road led to nothing but abandoned farmland and the crumbling remains of the old Riverside Dairy, a building that had been shut down since the early 70s. Brennan sent a team to search the area, and they found tire tracks, already half washed away by the rain. They found footprints, small, about Rebecca's size, leading into the field. And then, 50 yards from the road, they found her duffel bag. Inside were her gym clothes, her school books, a hair tie, her house keys, her wallet with $12 inside. But no Rebecca. The case made headlines, first local, then state, then national. Missing girl, small town, no leads. America ate it up. Television crews descended on Millbrook, their vans parked outside the Hayes home, their cameras capturing Dorothy's anguish for the evening news. Frank Hayes gave a tearful press conference, begging whoever had taken his daughter to bring her home. Tommy stood beside him, silent, his childhood stolen in an instant. Tips poured in. Dozens, then hundreds. Rebecca had been seen hitchhiking. Rebecca had been spotted at a truck stop in Iowa. Rebecca had run away to California, to New York, to Texas. None of it led anywhere. None. Every lead evaporated like morning fog. The FBI got involved. They set up a command center in the high school cafeteria, filled it with maps and photos and timelines. They interviewed hundreds of people. They ran background checks on every adult male in the county. They found nothing suspicious. No criminal records. No red flags. Millbrook was a clean town, full of good people who went to church on Sundays and waved to their neighbors. And yet Rebecca was gone. Weeks turned into months. The search parties stopped. The TV crews packed up and left. The FBI closed their command center and moved on to other cases. Life in Millbrook returned to something resembling normal, but the scars remained. Some parents drove their children to school instead of letting them walk. Doors stayed locked. Strangers were eyed with suspicion. Dorothy Hayes stopped cooking pot roast. She could not bear it. The smell reminded her of that night, of the empty chair at the dinner table. She spent her days sitting by the window, watching the road, waiting for Rebecca to come home. Frank threw himself into his work at the grain elevator, 12-hour days, 6 days a week. Anything to keep his mind occupied. Tommy grew quiet, withdrawn. He stopped hanging out with his friends, when his grades slipped. The Hayes family was broken, and no amount of time could fix it. Years passed. 1990, 1995, 2000. Rebecca Hayes became a ghost, a cautionary tale parents told their children. Remember what happened to that girl, they would say. But be careful. Stay close. Do not talk to strangers. Sheriff Brennan retired in 2003. He had never solved the case, and it haunted him. On his last day, he stood in the evidence room, staring at the box labeled Hayes Rebecca. Inside were the volleyball, the duffel bag, the photos from the search. He had looked at them 1,000 times, hoping to see something he had missed. He never did. The case went cold. Officially, permanently, devastatingly cold. But cold cases have a way of heating up again, especially when someone refuses to let them die. In 2018, a true crime podcast called Vanished Stories did an episode on Rebecca Hayes. The host, a woman named Lauren Mitchell, had grown up 2 towns over from Millbrook. She remembered the case, remembered the fear it had caused. She wanted answers. Lauren interviewed everyone she could find. Dorothy Hayes, now 74, her voice shaking but still hopeful. Frank Hayes, who had passed away in 2012 from a heart attack. Tommy Hayes, now 41, a mechanic in Omaha, still haunted by his sister's disappearance. Julie Winters, married now with 3 kids, still feeling guilty for not walking home with Rebecca that day. The podcast gained traction. Thousands of listeners downloaded it, shared it, discussed it online. New tips came in. Most were useless, but some were intriguing. One caller, a woman named Patricia Donnelly, said she had been driving down Riverside Road on the evening Rebecca disappeared. She had seen a car parked near the old dairy, a dark blue sedan with out-of-state plates. She had thought nothing of it at the time, but now, looking back, it seemed suspicious. Why had no one else mentioned this car? Lauren passed the information to the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department. The current sheriff, a younger man named David Ortega, reopened the case. He pulled the old files, reviewed the evidence, contacted the FBI. And then, in the summer of 2020, something happened that changed everything. A construction crew was clearing land for a new housing development about 3 miles from Riverside Road. They were using a backhoe to dig out tree stumps when the machine hit something solid. The operator climbed down to investigate. What he found made him vomit. Buried about 2 feet beneath the surface, Wrapped in a rotting tarp were human remains. The bones were small, delicate. Female. The medical examiner estimated the person had been a teenager, between 14 and 16 years old. Dental records were run. DNA samples were taken. 2 weeks later, the results came back. The remains belonged to Rebecca Hayes. She had been there all along, buried in the dirt, just miles from where she had vanished 31 years earlier. The news hit Millbrook like a bomb. Dorothy Hayes collapsed when she heard. She had spent 3 decades believing her daughter might still be alive, might come home someday. Now that hope was gone, replaced by a grief so raw it felt brand new. But the discovery raised more questions than it answered. Who had killed Rebecca? Why? How had they gotten away with it for so long? Sheriff Ortega reopened the investigation with renewed urgency. The remains were sent to a forensic lab for further analysis. What they found was chilling. Rebecca had been strangled. The hyoid bone in her throat showed clear signs of compression. She had been killed within hours of her disappearance, possibly minutes. Whoever had taken her had not kept her alive. There had been no ransom demand, no extended captivity. Just a quick, brutal murder. But there was something else. Something the medical examiner found that sent a chill down Ortega's spine. Fibers. Tiny threads of fabric embedded in the bones, preserved by the soil conditions. The lab analyzed them, ran them through databases, compared them to samples from Rebecca's clothing. They did not match. These fibers came from something else, something the killer had used. A blanket, maybe, or a tarp. The analysis revealed they were made of a specific type of polyester, manufactured by a company called Dalton Textiles. The company had gone out of business in 1991, but records showed they had sold their products primarily to industrial buyers, factories, warehouses, other construction companies. This was a clue, a real, tangible clue. Ortega began tracking down every business in the region that had purchased materials from Dalton Textiles between 1985 and 1991. It was painstaking work, but it was something. Meanwhile, the construction site where Rebecca's body had been found was examined in excruciating detail. Soil samples were taken. Ground-penetrating radar was used to search for additional remains. Investigators mapped the area, looking for any other evidence that might have been buried. And then, in September 2020, they found something else. Buried 3 feet from where Rebecca's body had been discovered, wrapped in a plastic bag, were clothes. Not just any clothes, a pair of jeans, a t-shirt, sneakers, all of them small, sized for a teenager. The clothing was sent to the lab. DNA testing confirmed what everyone feared. They belonged to Rebecca Hayes. But here is the thing: Rebecca had been wearing her volleyball uniform when she disappeared. Her gym clothes had been in the duffel bag. So whose clothes were these? The answer was as horrifying as it was confusing. These were the clothes Rebecca had been wearing before she changed for practice that day. Her school clothes. She had left them in her locker, same as always. Except now they were buried in the woods, 3 feet from her body. Someone had gone to the school after Rebecca disappeared. Someone had opened her locker, taken her clothes, and buried them with her. Someone who had access to the school. Someone who knew which locker was hers. Someone who was still out there. The investigation took on a new level of intensity. Sheriff Ortega compiled a list of everyone who had worked at Millbrook High School in 1989. Teachers, janitors, coaches, administrators. He ran background checks, conducted interviews, looked for any connection to Dalton Textiles. And then he found him. Gordon Pike, 68 years old, former janitor at Millbrook High School from 1987 to 1992. Lived alone in a trailer on the outskirts of town. No criminal record, no history of violence. But when Ortega dug deeper, he found something interesting. Pike had worked for a construction company in the early 80s. A company that had purchased tarps from Dalton Textiles. Ortega brought Pike in for questioning. Pike was calm, cooperative. He answered every question without hesitation. Yes, he had worked at the high school. Yes, he remembered Rebecca Hayes. Terrible tragedy. He had participated in the search, spent 3 nights walking through the fields, calling her name. No, he had no idea how her clothes ended up buried in the woods. Ortega pressed him. Asked about the tarps, the Dalton Textiles connection. Pike shrugged. Lots of companies used those tarps. It did not mean anything. They did not have enough to arrest him. No physical evidence linking him to the crime. And no witnesses. Just circumstantial connections and a gut feeling. But Ortega was not done. He obtained a warrant to search Pike's property. What they found in the trailer made everyone's blood run cold. In a locked toolbox beneath Pike's bed, wrapped in oilcloth, was a necklace. A small silver chain with a heart-shaped pendant. Engraved on the back were 2 initials, R.H. Rebecca Hayes. Dorothy Hayes had given her daughter that necklace for her 14th birthday. Rebecca had been wearing it the day she disappeared. Gordon Pike was arrested on the spot, charged with the murder of Rebecca Hayes. But even as the cuffs clicked around his wrists, Pike smiled. And he said something that made Ortega's skin crawl. He said, "You think you found her? You have no idea what you have really found." Gordon Pike sat in the interrogation room at Millbrook County Sheriff's Department, his hands folded calmly on the metal table. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his weathered face. Sheriff David Ortega sat across from him, 2 FBI agents flanking the door. The air was thick with tension, with the weight of 31 years of unanswered questions. Pike had not asked for a lawyer. He seemed almost amused by the whole situation, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. The necklace, Rebecca's necklace, sat in an evidence bag between them. Ortega leaned forward, his voice steady but cold. "Tell me about Rebecca Hayes." Pike tilted his head, studying the sheriff like a specimen under glass. Pretty girl. Blonde hair, blue eyes, always smiling in the hallways. The kind of child who made everyone feel good just by being around. You killed her. Men. Did I? Pike's smirk widened. You found a necklace. That is all you found. We found her body. We found her clothes. We found fibers that match materials you had access to. Pike chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. You think you solved this? You think you can close the case, give that poor mother some peace, make yourselves heroes? But you are missing the bigger picture, Sheriff. You are missing what really matters. One of the FBI agents, a woman named Special Agent Lisa Hartwell, stepped forward. She had been working cold cases for 15 years, had seen every kind of predator, every type of psychopath. But something about Pike unsettled her in a way she could not quite name. "What are we missing, Gordon?" she asked, her tone measured. Pike's eyes shifted to her, and for a moment something dark flickered behind them. "How many missing children cases has Millbrook County had in the last 40 years? Ortega's jaw tightened. "Rebecca Hayes is the only one." "Wrong." Pike leaned back in his chair, the metal legs scraping against the floor. "You just never found the others." The room went silent. The kind of silence that feels like a physical weight pressing down on your chest. Hartwell exchanged a glance with her partner, Special Agent Michael Torres. Torres pulled out a notepad, his hand already moving across the page. "What others?" Ortega demanded, his voice rising despite his attempt to stay composed. Pike said nothing for a long moment. Look, he seemed to be savoring the attention, the control he suddenly had over the room. Then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "There was a boy. 1981, 12 years old. Rode his bike to the swimming hole and never came back. Everyone thought he drowned. His bike was found by the water, his towel laid out on the rocks. But they never found a body, did they?" Ortega felt his stomach drop. He knew the case. Billy Ortega, no relation to the sheriff. It had been before his time, but the file was still in the archives. The assumption had always been accidental drowning, the body carried away by the current. "And there was a girl," Pike continued, his eyes distant now, as if seeing something the rest of them could not. 1976. 10 years old, vanished from her front yard while her mother was inside making dinner. They searched for weeks. Nothing. Just gone. Torres was writing furiously now. Hartwell had pulled out her phone, already sending messages to the field office, requesting archived case files. "Where are they?" Ortega asked, his voice barely controlled. "Where are the bodies?" Pike smiled again, that same unsettling expression. "You are standing on top of a graveyard, Sheriff. You just do not know how to see it." Over the next 48 hours, the investigation exploded. FBI forensic teams descended on Millbrook County with ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and excavation equipment. They started at the construction site where Rebecca's body had been found, then expanded outward in a grid pattern. The media caught wind of the developments. News vans returned to Millbrook, more than ever before. This was not just about Rebecca Hayes anymore. This was about a potential serial killer who had operated undetected for decades in a small Nebraska town. Dorothy Hayes watched the news from her living room, Tommy beside her. She could barely process what she was hearing. Her daughter's murderer had been caught, yes, but now there might be others. How many families had suffered the way hers had? How many mothers had spent decades wondering, hoping, praying? The first new discovery came on the third day of excavation. 200 yards from where Rebecca had been found, the radar detected an anomaly. The team dug carefully, methodically. What they unearthed made seasoned investigators turn away. A child's skeleton, small, fragile. The remains were sent immediately to the forensic lab. Dental records were compared against missing persons cases going back 50 years. The identification came back within a week. Amanda Garrison, age 10, reported missing from Millbrook County on July 14, 1976. She had been playing in her front yard. Her mother had gone inside for less than 5 minutes to check on dinner. When she came back out, Amanda was gone. But the case had gone cold within months. No leads, no witnesses, no evidence. The assumption had been abduction by a stranger passing through town, someone who had taken Amanda far away. But she had been there all along, buried in the woods, just 3 miles from her home. The second discovery came 4 days later. Another set of remains, this time identified as Billy Ortega, age 12, missing since August 1981. He had gone to the swimming hole on a hot summer afternoon and never returned. The diving teams had searched the water for weeks, and they had dragged the river. They had found his bike, his towel, his shoes neatly placed beside them. Everyone assumed he had drowned, that his body had been swept downstream and would never be recovered. But Gordon Pike had known better. Pike had taken him, killed him, buried him with the others. The question that haunted everyone was simple and terrible: how many more were there? Pike refused to talk. After his initial confession, or whatever that cryptic statement had been, he shut down completely. He sat in his cell, staring at the wall, smiling that same unsettling smile. His court-appointed lawyer advised him to stay silent. And the evidence was mounting. Every day brought new discoveries, new horrors. But Pike seemed unconcerned. He ate his meals. He slept soundly. He showed no remorse, no fear, no emotion at all. Sheriff Ortega could not sleep. He spent his nights in the office, going through old case files, looking for patterns. Missing children, missing teenagers, even missing adults. And anything that might connect to Pike. What he found was chilling. Between 1975 and 1992, the years Pike had lived in Millbrook County, there had been 11 unsolved disappearances. Not all were children. 2 were young women in their 20s. 1 was a teenage boy. The rest were children between the ages of 8 and 15. 11 people. 11 families destroyed. And no one had connected the dots because the cases were spread out over 17 years. Because Millbrook was a small town where bad things were not supposed to happen. Because Pike had been so careful, so patient. The excavation continued. The search area expanded to cover nearly 10 square miles of wooded land surrounding Millbrook. The FBI brought in additional teams, specialists in forensic archaeology. The process was painstaking but necessary. 2 weeks after Pike's arrest, they found the third body, and then the fourth, then the fifth. Each discovery was announced to the public. Each announcement brought fresh waves of grief to families who had spent decades in agonizing limbo. Some had moved away, trying to escape the pain. Others had stayed, unable to leave, clinging to the hope that their loved ones might someday return. Now they had answers. Horrible, devastating answers, but answers nonetheless. By early November 2020, the count stood at 7 confirmed victims, 7 bodies recovered. 7 families finally able to lay their loved ones to rest. But Pike had mentioned 11 cases. Ortega's research had identified 11 disappearances, but that meant 4 were still missing. Hartwell confronted Pike one final time. She sat across from him in the interrogation room, her patience worn thin, her professional demeanor cracking. "Where are the others?" she demanded. "You owe these families the truth. You owe them closure." Pike looked at her with those dead eyes, and for the first time he laughed. A genuine, chilling laugh that echoed off the concrete walls. "You still do not understand," he said. "You think this is about bodies in the ground. You think this is about me, but it is so much bigger than that." "What are you talking about?" Pike leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I was not alone." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Hartwell felt her blood run cold. "What do you mean, you were not alone?" "There were 2 of us, partners. We worked together for years. I did the hunting. He did the cleanup. Perfect system. And you know what the best part was? He is still out there. Still free. Still hunting." Bun. Hartwell's mind raced. Could this be true? Or was Pike playing games, trying to extend his moment of control, his 15 minutes of infamy? She pressed him. "Who? Give me a name." Pike smiled and leaned back. "Figure it out, agent. You are supposed to be good at this." That was the last thing Gordon Pike ever said about the case. He retreated into silence, refused all further interviews. But his trial was set for the following spring. But Hartwell could not let it go. If there was an accomplice, if there was someone else involved, they needed to find him. She started digging into Pike's life, his employment history, his associates, his known acquaintances. Pike had been a loner, mostly. No close friends, no family in the area. But there had to be someone, some connection she was missing. She went back through the case files, looking for anything that stood out. The 1976 case, Amanda Garrison, had been investigated by Sheriff Tom Brennan. The 1981 case, Billy Ortega, also Brennan. The 1989 case, Rebecca Hayes, Brennan again. Brennan had been sheriff for 23 years. He had retired in 2003. He had died in 2015 from complications of diabetes. Hartwell pulled Brennan's personnel file, read through his career history. Decorated officer, respected member of the community. No red flags. But then she found something. A small detail easily overlooked. In 1974, before he became sheriff, Brennan had worked construction. The same construction company where Gordon Pike had been employed. And they had known each other. They had worked together. Hartwell's pulse quickened. She pulled phone records, old employment records, anything she could find. The companies had gone out of business decades ago, but some records still existed in county archives. What she discovered made her sick. Brennan and Pike had not just worked together. They had been close. They had carpooled to job sites. They had eaten lunch together every day for nearly 3 years. And then, in 1975, right around the time the disappearances started, they had stopped working together. Pike had taken the janitor job at the school. Brennan had joined the sheriff's department. But they had stayed in touch. Property records showed that Brennan owned a hunting cabin about 15 miles outside of Millbrook. Neighbors reported seeing Pike's truck there occasionally over the years. Hartwell assembled a team. They drove out to the cabin, which had been abandoned since Brennan's death. It was a small, dilapidated structure surrounded by dense woods. They obtained a warrant and went inside. The cabin was dusty, filled with old furniture and forgotten belongings. But in the basement, behind a false wall, they found a room with chains bolted to the floor, a room with photographs pinned to the walls. Photographs of children. Photographs of Rebecca Hayes, Amanda Garrison, Billy Ortega, and others. And in the corner, in a locked metal box, they found trophies. Personal items taken from the victims. Jewelry, hair ribbons, a watch, a keychain. Tom Brennan, the respected sheriff who had spent decades searching for answers to cases he himself had helped create, had been Gordon Pike's partner all along, and the revelation shattered Millbrook County. The man they had trusted, the man they had turned to in their darkest moments, had been a monster. He had conducted the investigations into his own crimes, had misdirected searches, had ensured evidence was never found. Dorothy Hayes learned that the man who had held her hand and promised to find her daughter had been one of the people responsible for taking Rebecca away. The betrayal was beyond comprehension. But there was still one question: where were the remaining 4 victims? Hartwell and her team searched the cabin property. They used the same forensic techniques that had been employed at the construction site: ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, systematic excavation, and they found them. All 4, buried in the woods behind the cabin, their graves carefully hidden beneath layers of brush and soil. The final count was 11 victims, 11 lives stolen over 17 years, 11 families destroyed by 2 men who had operated in plain sight, protected by a badge and the trust of a community. Gordon Pike was convicted on all counts in April 2021. He received 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He showed no emotion when the verdict was read. He simply smiled that same unsettling smile and was led away. The case closed, officially. The families held memorial services. The town erected a monument in the park, 11 names engraved in stone, a reminder of what had been lost. But for those who lived through it, for those who remembered, the scars remained. Dorothy Hayes passed away in her sleep 6 months after Pike's conviction. Tommy said she had finally found peace, knowing the truth, knowing Rebecca could rest. The town of Millbrook never fully recovered. Some families moved away, unable to bear the weight of the memories. Others stayed, determined to rebuild, to reclaim their community from the darkness. Years passed. The story faded from national headlines. Millbrook became quiet again, just another small town in Nebraska. But in 2024, something happened that ripped open old wounds. A hiker exploring state land 40 miles north of Millbrook found something buried in a ravine. Bones, small bones, a child's bones. The remains were examined. DNA was extracted and run through databases. No match. The child was not one of Pike and Brennan's 11 victims. This was someone else. Someone new, or rather someone old. Forensic analysis dated the remains to the mid-1990s, after Pike had stopped, after Brennan had retired. Which meant one of 2 things: either there was a third killer operating in the region, someone who had learned from Pike and Brennan, or one of them had lied. One of them had continued hunting even after their partnership ended. Pike was in prison, serving 11 life sentences. Brennan was dead. But the bones did not lie. Someone had killed this child and buried them in the woods. Someone who was never caught. Someone who might still be out there. Sheriff David Ortega stood in his office, staring at the case file for this new victim. Unidentified. No missing persons report matched the description. It was as if this child had never existed, had simply been erased from the world. He thought about Pike's words from that first interrogation: "You think you solved this, but you are missing the bigger picture." What if Pike had been telling the truth? What if there had been more than just him and Brennan? What if there was a network, a group of predators operating across the region, sharing information, helping each other evade detection? The thought was too horrifying to fully contemplate. But Ortega could not ignore the evidence in front of him. He picked up the phone and called Special Agent Hartwell. "We need to talk," he said. "I think this is bigger than we thought." Hartwell arrived in Millbrook the next day. She looked at the new remains, read the forensic reports, and came to the same conclusion Ortega had. "We missed something," she said quietly. "We thought we had them all. But we were wrong." They reopened the investigation. They went back through every piece of evidence from the original case. They re-examined the cabin, the construction site, Pike's trailer, and they interviewed Pike again, but he refused to speak. And then, buried in the case files, Hartwell found a single piece of paper, a receipt from 1994, found in Brennan's cabin but never fully examined. It was for a storage unit in a town 60 miles away. The unit had been rented under a fake name, but the handwriting matched Brennan's. They tracked down the storage facility. Amazingly, it was still in operation. The unit had been abandoned, the rent unpaid for decades. The management had cleared it out years ago, sold off the contents to pay the debt, but they had kept records. Photo documentation of what had been inside before it was sold. Hartwell scrolled through the digital files, her hands shaking. What she saw made her realize the true scope of the horror. The storage unit had contained boxes, dozens of boxes, each one labeled with a year and a number, and inside each box, according to the photos, were more trophies, more personal items, more evidence of victims that had never been found, victims that were not part of the original 11. The investigation exploded once more. The FBI traced every item sold from the storage unit, tracked down buyers, recovered what they could. Each item was catalogued, analyzed, compared against missing persons databases. By the end of 2024, they had identified 7 more potential victims, 7 more children who had vanished between 1975 and 2000. Their disappearances spread across 3 states, and never connected because the jurisdictions were different, because the methods varied, because no one had been looking for a pattern. Ike and Brennan had not been working alone, and they had not limited their activities to Millbrook County. This was a network, a conspiracy of predators that had operated for decades, crossing state lines, evading detection through careful planning and cooperation. And the most terrifying part, some of the items in the storage unit were dated after Brennan's death in 2015, which meant someone had continued his work. Someone was still active. The case remains open. The FBI has established a task force dedicated to identifying all the victims and finding anyone else who may have been involved. As of October 2025, 18 victims have been confirmed, 11 from Millbrook County, 7 from other locations. But investigators believe there are more. The storage unit photos show items that have not yet been connected to any known disappearances. Children who vanished so completely that no one even reported them missing. Runaways, perhaps. Or children from broken homes where no one cared enough to look. Gordon Pike remains in prison. He watches the news coverage of the ongoing investigation and smiles. He has never admitted to anything beyond the original 11. He takes pleasure in the mystery, in the knowledge that even from behind bars, he still has power over the investigation. The town of Millbrook will never be the same. The monument in the park now has 18 names, with space left for more. Dorothy Hayes never knew about the expanded scope of the crimes. Perhaps that is a mercy. Tommy Hayes, now 47, has become an advocate for missing children. He works with organizations dedicated to solving cold cases, to giving families the answers they deserve. He says it is what Rebecca would have wanted. And somewhere out there, investigators believe someone is watching all of this unfold. Someone who knows the truth. Someone who was part of the network. Someone who is still free. The question that haunts everyone involved is simple. How do you catch a predator who has spent decades perfecting the art of invisibility? How do you find someone who has learned from the mistakes of those who came before? The answer is you keep looking. You never stop. You follow every lead, examine every piece of evidence, and you trust that eventually they will slip up. Because they always do. Evil cannot hide forever. The truth always finds a way to surface, even if it takes 31 years. Even if it takes longer, the investigation continues. The search goes on. And in the woods outside Millbrook, beneath the soil and the fallen leaves, there may still be secrets waiting to be found.